Comrade Pat, we're now live streamed. You can start.
Okay, great. Okay, comrades. So, welcome to everybody again. I am expecting more people will join us, and probably a whole lot more when the presentation is done and we start the discussion, because that's when the live stream gets cut off. Um, but, comrades, we want to welcome Comrade Vijay Prashad here, who's joining us today, somebody that we've been hearing about a lot and reading some of his stuff. So, Comrade Vijay, welcome and thank you so much for coming to our session today. So, we don't know each other, but I'm reading from the advert here. Comrade Vijay Prasad is an Indian Marxist historian, a journalist, political commentator, and editor, and executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief correspondent at Globetrotter. I thought it actually said before chief correspondent and Globetrotter, but I see it's actually a publication called Globetrotter. Author of over 40 books and known for his critiques of capitalism, imperialism, and US hegemony. And his work centers on the global south, socialist movements, and anti colonial struggles. So, Comrade Vijay, can I hand over to you to talk to us?
Well, first, greetings to our comrades in the South African Communist Party. I take this as an immense honor to participate in the Jack Simon School. So, thanks very much for inviting me. Secondly, I'm sort of pretending that this is the pre-game show because most people here are probably setting themselves up for the match tonight, the fixture against Canada. And I'm thinking that your head is elsewhere. So this really is the pre-game show. So you can rest easy a little bit. I'll try not to get too heavy on anybody. I'm very cognizant of the fact that this World Cup is almost part of the international class struggle. First, we saw Iran there playing its role in Los Angeles, in Seattle, in different places, Houston, fighting for their national right, fighting for their existence. Trump keeps saying he's going to destroy their civilization. There they were on the field, equipping themselves so well. Then we celebrated Cape Verde, another stalwart of national liberation, holding Spain 2-2. And well, now let's see what South Africa does. Complicated, contradictory South Africa, but not perhaps when it comes to the football. If we were discussing cricket, I wouldn't be so charitable to you, but that's for another day, Comrade Horn. Yeah, Comrade Pat, that's definitely for another day. I want to start by reading you a poem that I wrote. I'm in Johannesburg today and I was at Fordsburg, and I decided after the kind of sensory experience of going back to one of my favorite places in the city to write a poem. So I want to start with that and then I'll explain what I'll do for the rest of the time. So here's Sunday at Fordsburg. And I'm going to start with something called a pan, which is something you chew and spit from. It has a little tobacco in it, but it's generally pretty sweet. So the word pan will appear in the first line of the poem. The pan dissolves slowly into cardamom and lime, its sweetness bargaining with the afternoon. Fordsburg keeps the old republic of small shops, tailors, butchers, telephones to distant grief. In the windows, the kafias wait without impatient, folded like maps no border has defeated. A child runs past carrying warm bread while Gaza arrives again on every screen. One grows ashamed of being accustomed. The century has perfected that habit. Even sorrow learns to queue for service. The men behind the counters lower their voices, not because hope has vanished, but because hope now pays rent by the week. Outside, another argument blames Africa for hunger as though the wound had turned against the hand. A nation disappointed with its broken promises searches too often for strangers to inherit the blame. The wind gathers dust along Albertina Sisulu Road. I finish the pan and taste both sugar and iron. The world appears to be rehearsing another catastrophe. Yet somewhere beneath these pavements, stubborn as seed, the people are preparing an answer not yet ready to flower. So that's Sunday at Fordsburg. I wrote it today and I want to give it to you in the Jack Simon School. Today, I'm thinking that what I'm going to present to you is pretty structural, pretty didactic, pretty straightforward. I'm going to present to you something that comes in two parts, but with an interlude in between. The first part is to explain what I think of and have sort of put together as the 5 principles of national liberation Marxism, which is really the Marxism of our tradition, whether it's the communist parties in South Africa, in India, the Communist Party in Indonesia, the communist parties all across the African continent, Latin America, Asia. These are the communist parties of the tricontinental. In this part of the world, the formerly colonized part of the world, including South Africa, colonialism of a special type, in all these parts of the world, we had to, as Frantz Fanon wrote, slightly stretch our Marxism. Our Marxism couldn't just come directly from the writings of Karl Marx. In fact, Comrade Lenin himself slightly stretched Marxism. And that is why Lenin, understanding that the large Tsarist empire, a huge colonial enterprise in its own right, that is why Lenin himself in 1915, 2 years before the revolution, in a debate with Rosa Luxemburg, another terrific comrade, Lenin wrote about the right of nations to self-determination. He also wrote in 1913, 2 years after the revolutions in Mexico and in China, he wrote that Europe is backward, Asia is forward, Asia is on the march. He meant China, but he could very well, if he had known more about it, meant the revolution in Mexico led by the peasants whose remarkable brigand leaders were Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. Lenin was impressed that it was in the colonized parts of the world that there was such motion towards the emancipation of humanity, that Europe at the time wasn't moving with the same pace. He already recognized that. He saw that. And then in 1919, and then finally 1920, when the Communist International is founded, he's very eager to bring in comrades from the colonized world fighting for national liberation. When Ho Chi Minh of Indochina, later Vietnam, read what Lenin had written, he said the sun broke through the clouds and it was bright from the sky. It's the first time he had read something like Lenin's writings on colonialism. Our tradition comes straight out of Lenin through people like Ho Chi Minh, Comrade Chairman Mao, Jose Carlos Mariátegui in Peru, EMS Namboodiripad in India. It comes through people like Moses Kotane in South Africa. Ours is a special tradition which we need to harness and understand because it has particularities. So first I'm going to give you those 5 principles. Then there's a small interlude, and then I'm going to propose some ideas for now. So I hope this is adequate to at least generate a discussion. So now the first 5 principles of what we can think of as classic national liberation Marxism. The first principle was that national liberation was the concrete form of class struggle in the oppressed world. In other words, in countries shaped by colonialism and imperialism, the central contradiction was not just between capital and labor, within the national territory, but between the sovereign development of the people and the structures of imperial domination. This secondary and primary contradiction between capital and labor on the one side, the primary contradiction of capitalism, had actually wrapped into it a kind of primary part two for the colonies, which was the contradiction between the sovereign development of the people and the structures of imperial domination. In other words, the fight against imperialism. The struggle for national sovereignty was therefore an indispensable terrain of working class politics. It was not a diversion from it, it was an indispensable terrain. That's the first principle of our understanding of national liberation Marxism, that national liberation was the concrete form of class struggle in the oppressed world. It was the concrete form of the class struggle in the oppressed world. It wasn't some secondary or some other proposition, but the concrete form of the class struggle was national liberation in the oppressed or colonized world. The second principle, political sovereignty, it was understood very early on. Political sovereignty without economic sovereignty is incomplete. This is what many of our national liberation leaders call flag independence. Put the flag up, have a national anthem, you can sing it as loudly as you want. You can burnish your national credentials, wear your Bafana shirts. You can have political sovereignty, but without economic transformation, your political sovereignty itself is incomplete. You are not actually political sovereign. You have a flag, you have a national anthem, you have your shirt for your football team, but your political sovereignty is compromised by the lack of economic transformation. Formal independence, we've by now seen it everywhere, has left intact colonial economic structures, dependence on commodity exports, dependence on foreign finance, dependence on multinational corporations, military subordination, and of course, technological dependence. So national liberation must therefore include, and even something known at the time, it's not retrospectively, it had to include industrialization, agrarian reform, public ownership of strategic sectors, food sovereignty, and technological capacity. This was already very clear to our comrades in the 1930s and 40s. They didn't need the lessons of experience. They already knew that without agrarian reform, without industrialization, national liberation itself, forget the socialist project, national liberation would be incomplete. The second point was political sovereignty without economic transformation means that your political sovereignty is incomplete. The third point, the national popular bloc is the social basis of transformation. By the second Comintern meeting, the second meeting of the Communist International in 1920, by that meeting, the debate between Comrade Lenin and Comrade M.N. Roy over the question of the relationship of the communists to the forces of national liberation. In India, the Congress Party, for instance. What should be the communist relationship to Mahatma Gandhi? This was a big debate, but it was a debate resolved on the basis that the national popular bloc is the social basis of transformation. The working class cannot lead in isolation. And therefore, successful national liberation requires an alliance of workers, peasants, informal workers, progressive intellectuals, youth, women, indigenous people, patriotic sectors committed to sovereignty. And in some cases, this was inclusive of the undeveloped colonized bourgeoisie. In fact, in the Chinese Revolution, till today, the patriotic sections of the bourgeoisie are considered part of the national popular bloc because they themselves struggle with the lack of political sovereignty and economic subordination of their national territory. So until and unless they have exhausted their ability to be patriotic, they are part of this bloc. That was known to us from the beginning. The fourth point about the classical national liberation Marxism is that internationalism grows from sovereign struggles rather than replacing them. You see, national liberation from the beginning was never national liberation in the European sense. How could it have been? I grew up speaking a number of languages. In India, there are hundreds of languages. How can you import the European idea of a nation is a people with a blood, with a, this, that, and the other, the stuff that was so impressive to chauvinism or to fascism, to fascist type of nationalism. That was never the nationalism of the colonized peoples. Our nationalism was always anti-colonial. Our nationalism was always deeply internationalist. It always had within it the Bandung spirit, later the spirit of the Tricontinental Conference, Havana, Cuba, 1966, 50 years ago. Our nationalism was always internationalist. It wasn't narrow. It had to be internationalist because we were made up of multiple peoples. We never had that singular German sort of idea of, German intellectual idea of one people, one blood, and so on. We didn't have that. We couldn't have that. It was materially impossible. This doesn't mean it's materially possible in Europe. It's equally impossible in Europe. They also have national territories filled with peoples from all over the place with all kinds of languages. Yeah, it's impossible to have that nationalism. Impossible in Europe, but absolutely impossible in the colonized parts of the world where our borders were drawn not by the historical development patterns, but by colonialism. You couldn't have chauvinist forms of nationalism. It was impossible. It should never have been tolerated. Our nationalism was always internationalist. On the African continent, the concept Pan-Africanism, which Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana championed, was always part of the national popular project. It was never outside it, something that was external to our sovereign struggles. So that's the fourth point. Internationalism grows from sovereign struggles, does not replace them. And the fifth point of our classical tradition of national liberation is that organization remains decisive. Our national liberation struggles, they are sustained through democratic discipline in political organization by the growth of mass movements, popular education, institutions capable of resisting imperialist pressure. Without those institutions capable of resisting imperialist pressure, we will be crushed. The independent strength of the working class and peasantry had to be built. Otherwise, within the national popular bloc, the bourgeoisie would dominate. Because the bourgeoisie, the national element of the bourgeoisie, its patriotism was not infinite. It is patriotic towards its class before it is patriotic towards anything called the nation. Its patriotism isn't infinite. So, building the independent strength of the working class and the peasantry was vital to our national liberation Marxism, so that we could not only check the power of the growing power of the national bourgeoisie, but also diminish it, overcome it, and open a socialist path. That was the crucial fifth element of classical national liberation Marxism, that organization remains decisive. Comrades, these are the five elements of a classical national liberation Marxism. National liberation is a concrete form of class struggle in the oppressed world. Political sovereignty without economic transformation, it's incomplete. The national popular bloc is the social basis of transformation. Internationalism grows from sovereign struggles rather than replacing them. And finally, organization of the working class and peasantry remains decisive. Now, that was classical national liberation Marxism. Since then, there have been many, many changes. Our theories have had to undergo immense alteration. We can't return to the source, as Amilcar Cabral said. Read only Cabral or read only our thinkers from that period, although to read them is vital. And in South Africa, the publishing house Inkani Books has as its mandate to reprint the classics. I highly recommend for you the reprint of Goan Mbeki's The Peasants' Revolt, about the revolt in Pondoland, which Inkani Books has just published with a splendid forward by the General Secretary. General Secretary writes a really strong forward. Soili Mapaila's text is highly recommended for itself, but combined with Comrade Goan Mbeki's account of the revolt in Pondoland, you get a sense in the classical Marxist national liberation literature of some of the points I've been making here. By the way, that text was assisted in the writing by Comrade Ruth First, one of the martyrs from the South African Communist Party. I highly recommend that text as a way to understand classical national liberation Marxism. Of the many changes that have happened since that period, I want to emphasize two of them. First, the rise and hegemony of neoliberalism, the politics of privatization, commodification of everything, the destruction of the life world without care for social costs, the way in which our states have been just turned over fully to capital and so on. This has ravaged our societies and it has really cannibalized our states. We are in a bad way with this development. It has hit our societies like a tsunami. It has devastated our society. It has allowed multinational capital, which didn't exist so sophisticatedly in the earlier period. Multinational capital now has created labor modes so that most workers are precarious, informalized, unable to be in unions, and so on. This is a very important transformation, and it is quite fundamental. Whether there's a liberal government in power anywhere in the world, in the global north, global south, or a far right of a special type government, it doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. The hegemony of neoliberalism is basically complete. We haven't been able to overcome it, to go beyond it. Actually, that period of absolute dominion of multinational corporations over human life is quite shattering. The second transformation in this period, this long period since classical Marxist national liberation, this in this period, the second development of great importance to us is the absolute exhaustion of national liberation project and of social democracy. I mean, national liberation and social democracy have basically given up their historical mission. The National Liberation Project, this, the Congress Party in India, large sections of the African National Congress, parties of national liberation, other parts of the continent, they have just uprooted their sticks and decided they no longer accept the ideas of patriotism that once governed our national struggles against colonialism. They no longer believe that they have a patriotic duty to society. There's an absolute exhaustion of social democracies, uninterested in social welfare. People may starve, live on the street, etc. These ideas, which would have been anathema to an earlier generation of social democrats, and certainly anathema to the bourgeois national liberation leaders of an earlier period, are now absolutely commonplace. If people don't work, they don't eat, let them starve, and so on. What this has meant is that for the left, not only do we have to operate on a very difficult terrain of fighting against sophisticated multinational capital, building the phalanxes of the working class and peasantry, now largely a precarious proletariat. Not only do we have to do that, but we have to also do the work of the bourgeois national liberation and social democrats. We have to fight for social welfare. We have to defend those who are suffering from misery. As communists, we cannot afford to allow people to just die on the street from hunger. We have to enter that terrain. So we are now obliged to do two historical missions: the historical mission of social democracy to help people today, and to fight for social transformation. This is why the debate between Bernstein and Luxemburg over 100 years ago, between reform and revolution, has been basically transformed. No more are we able to debate whether we do reforms, evolutionary socialism, or revolution. We have to do both actually now. because social democracy in the previous period at least picked up the cudgel of reform. It was social democracy fighting for reforms and so on, for some trade union rights and ensure that the peasantry weren't starving. That was social democracy. Now they are gone. So the debate, Luxembourg's text, reform versus revolution, is no longer the text for us because we can't debate that. We have to do both. And that's because of the absolute exhaustion of the bourgeois forces of national liberation and of social democracy. So those are the two decisive transformations, in my opinion: the hegemony of neoliberalism and the absolute exhaustion of national liberation and social democracy. Now, 5 points. I'm going to run through these and then we can have a discussion. 5 points on the national liberation Marxism for our time. I was being immodest this afternoon. I wrote down after that a program of action, but this is not a program of action. These are notes. I've just jotted down some notes. I hope you find the notes of use in debate and discussion. It's not really a program, but look how communists and Marxists think. We think everything must be a program. It has been discussed by nobody but a few people. Can't have this as a program. It's merely a notes for discussion. So let me run through these notes fairly straightforwardly, okay, in one by one, and then see what we think. Okay, the first one is to rebuild productive sovereignty. See, I was looking at these numbers earlier this month. The African continent is the home of about 20% of the world's population, roughly 20%. The African continent graduates only 3% of the world's engineers. I was looking at these numbers when I was spending some time in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, and I was advising with a group of economists what a program could be for the Alliance for Sahel States. What could be a program to rebuild productive sovereignty? And there, when I saw this number, 3% of the world's engineers, it just hit me very hard. I was deeply pained by this number because this number is itself inaccurate. As people were saying in Ouagadougou, it doesn't matter that we graduate 3%. How many of them stay on the African continent? How many of them, let's say the so-called Francophone part of Africa, how many of them from there go to France to seek employment? How many people from the so-called Anglophone or English-speaking parts of the continent go to the US, Canada, UK, and so on to seek employment? Australia, New Zealand, God knows where people go. How many people leave after having got their degrees? So even the 3% number may be inflated. You can't rebuild productive sovereignty without launching ambitious programs of scientific and technological education and research, building industrial policy for a society, food production, agrarian reform, how to build infrastructure. I mean, it's ludicrous that we don't have a plan as a continental left. It's ludicrous that there's no plan for an African left to talk about African infrastructure, building high-speed trains, a high-speed train running from, for instance, Johannesburg to Durban, and then from Durban to Maputo, and then upward. Why not run a train from Johannesburg up to, Lesotho and then go to Zimbabwe? Why not? Why not start a plan, a project, start thinking about what rebuilding productive sovereignty would look like? What would this look like? What would an economic plan which prioritizes productive capacity, not financial speculation, rentier accumulation, what would this look like? How to hold people within the continent for a Pan-Africanist project? If you don't rebuild productive sovereignty, which comes alongside a point I'm going to make later, which is rebuilding a kind of socialist patriotism. If we don't do that, it doesn't go anywhere. You can't have a moral politics of national liberation Marxism. Communism is not just a moral force, it is that. But it's also a force rooted in material reality. So what is the material plan? We can't just tell people, have faith in us. We have to have a plan, a vision, and in that building or rebuilding productive sovereignty is crucial. Second one is constructing democratic popular power. I mean, I am very, very impressed by the People's Red Caravan. I was telling comrades that much more needs to be made of it. More texts need to be written about it. In fact, from Tricontinental in November, we have pledged ourselves to publish a dossier on the People's Red Caravan. We're already writing it. I'm very happy with the progress we are making. We need to make more progress to lift it up, like the cooperative movement in Kerala. You can go to the Tricontinental website and read a very nice text written by comrades in the Kerala cooperatives. 4.5 million women in the cooperative called Kudumbushri. Fantastic essay by Subin Dennis. Highly recommend it. The landless workers in Brazil, million families living on settlements, farming agroecologically, growing their produce, growing for the market, and so on. They are building in the People's Red Caravan in Kerala, in the cooperative movement, and in the MST settlements. They are building what Ernst Bloch called the not yet of socialism. It's not yet socialism, but it's getting there. It's a very important concept, not yet of socialism. Construct democratic popular power now. This can't be done merely through this can't be done merely through contesting elections and seeking state power. Communists must first seek social power. We must seek power over society through the development of neighborhood committees, trade unions, women's organizations, etc., youth movements. We have to seek power over society first, and for that, you need to construct democratic popular power. Seek power over society. Social power must precede state power. One must come before the other, in my opinion. These are important stages to think about. Third point, break the architecture of dependency. It's remarkable. I mean, if you look at the situation today, it's remarkable how countries remain so vulnerable to sanctions, to debt conditionality, monopoly control over technology. The architecture of dependency is alive and well. Look, Trump threatens to sanction South Africa, and South Africa's president jumps up and says, how do I prevent the sanctions? How do I make you get less angry with me, etc.? I mean, it's incredible how the architecture of dependency has remained intact despite the fact we've almost got 20 years of the BRICS Plus project. Why aren't we expanding South-South institutions, into finance, trade, technology, etc.? But also, and here's the interesting part, South-South solidarity of communists. Why aren't we learning from each other? Much more information, South-South. Our countries need to share our experiences in a much more honest and deliberate way. Less protocol, more conversation, less diplomacy, less diplomacy, more comradliness. We have to break the architecture of dependency where we are going north to seek answers. Much more south-south, interaction. And in a sense, I'm really happy that I'm here today because I feel like this is part of that south-south communist, solidarity and building knowledge together. Number four, we have to fight the ideological struggle for the future. This means we have to lift up the term from Fidel Castro, Batalha de Ideas, the battle of ideas, but also what in our institute we call a battle of emotions. We're building independent media, publishing, research institutions. Tricontinental is part of this. So is Inkani Books, building cultural institutions. I don't know if you've ever visited the Forge in Johannesburg last night. There was such an amazing set of performances by poets, the best of young South African jazz. There was talks and so on, building cultural institutions, building digital platforms that are capable of challenging imperialist narratives, overcoming political demoralization. That's the battle of emotions. To overcome political demoralization, we need a renewed national liberation Marxist project. And that requires confidence, the confidence that history can still be consciously made by organized people. That's our talisman, our hallmark. that history can be made consciously by organized people. We have to have a renewed project for that. That's the battle of ideas. Go to people with a renewed sense of its possibility. And finally, for a reborn national liberation Marxism of our time, we have to advance a serious politics of peace against hyper-imperialism. 2 years ago, Tricontinental published a text on hyper-imperialism. We made the argument that it is absolutely without any data to suggest that there is an inter-imperialist conflict today. I can go on this at length. Comrade Lenin's text from 1916 was written for a certain conjuncture to explain why the European countries went into war. That was what was being explained there. Also, it was written at a time when capitalist firms operated within national containers. They no longer do so. They don't operate in national containers, they operate multinationally. We have to actually revisit the material foundation of imperialism. And we coined the term hyper-imperialism. What we mean is the US-led bloc, the hyper-imperialist bloc, has found that it is losing control in three areas of human life: losing control over raw materials, losing control of science and technology, losing control of financial systems. But it maintains control over two areas: information and war. 80% of the global military budget is held by the NATO plus countries. 80% of the global annual military budget by the NATO plus countries. They can bomb anybody. That doesn't mean they can win wars. Strategically, United States and Israel were outclassed by Iran. The United States had to retreat from Afghanistan, defeated in Vietnam. That doesn't matter. They can still destroy countries. That scares countries. It makes countries not want to exert their national sovereignty. We need to build a serious politics of peace. The strategic objective should be not merely to survive imperialist pressure, but to create the political space within which ideas like democratic planning, social equality, ecological sustainability, and indeed socialism can develop. It's very important for us. It's not like the revival of a national liberation socialism needs to happen. It's already happening all over the place. I've indicated some of the moments where it's happening. But we also have to be largely, we have to be mentally right there. We have to be fighting this ideologically. Comrades, it's important for us, for our political education to be at the very highest level, for us to have the confidence ideologically, the ideological armor to defend our positions. We must be much more visible in the battle of ideas. We have a project. We have a history. Our history is not only the history of the Marxist tradition or of the international communist tradition, but it also has a special component, this national liberation Marxist tradition. Where from Mao to Mariátegui, we have very important political theorists, not just people who acted, on society. South African communists built a theory. They didn't just apply some external theory. We need to defend our own tradition, and then we need to build a new project out of the elements of which we already are working. So, comrades, that's where I feel we are. If you don't mind, I'm going to read the last stanza of the poem I wrote called Fordsburg on Sunday, which I read at the beginning for those who didn't come. The last stanza goes, "The world appears to be rehearsing another catastrophe. Yet somewhere beneath these pavements, stubborn as seed, the people are preparing an answer, not yet ready to flower." So thanks a lot, comrades. Thanks for having me here, and I hope your questions will come hard and fast.
Thank you very much, Comrade Vijay. That was great. So I think, comrades, let's apply